Hello and welcome. I'm Kenzie.
And I'm Carli, and this is Ask a Therapist.
Each week, we explore life's most relatable questions, from relationships and boundaries to burnout and self-worth, all through a therapist's lens.
We're licensed therapists, but this isn't therapy. It's a place for insight, reflection, and a little humor along the way.
Your questions,
our insights.
Ask a Therapist. This podcast is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only. The content shared should not be considered a substitute for professional mental health care, diagnosis, or treatment. We strongly encourage listeners to seek help from a licensed mental health professional for any personal or psychological concerns.
Any advice or commentary offered is based solely on the information provided. As such, we cannot guarantee any specific outcomes, and the feedback given should not be interpreted as professional mental health advice. If you are experiencing a mental health crisis, please call 911, 988, or 211.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Ask a Therapist. This is episode 13, and this week we are focusing on losing respect for a mentor, which is a very interesting topic, and I think can be applied to a lot of different relationships, not just a mentor-mentee. And so, yeah, we're excited for this one. We just want to share a quick reminder that while our questions are specific to listener submissions, the insight and responses we share are meant to be supportive and applicable to anybody who may be listening. So please tune in, and hopefully you can apply some of our thoughts to your own relationships. We're excited to explore this with you all, so let's get started. Carli, please start us off with the icebreaker.
No problem. So this is a good one that, as we're talking about a mentor-mentee relationship, this is kind of like a good maybe parallel to that. But the question is, what's something people assume therapists are amazing at that you're actually still working on?
Okay. I like this one. I mean, I like it for so many reasons. I feel like it definitely ties into our question today of kind of like this idea that you have about people and maybe them not necessarily like meeting those expectations. And I feel like this happens a lot in therapy. Obviously, like the therapist role is some pretty big shoes to fill, and you're talking to people about, a lot of like just tools and techniques and regulating and all these different kind of things. And just because you might have a lot of knowledge around it doesn't always necessarily mean that it's like easy to implement. And I feel like that's, part of that is why we can understand and empathize when clients are struggling with it, because we're human too. And we struggle with this stuff. So, I think that my biggest one is probably like I can get stuck, like if I'm feeling overwhelmed, I can get stuck in a little bit of like freeze mode where I'm just kind of like, my body is like responding to feeling overwhelmed by just kind of wanting to like shut down. And it's definitely been a work in progress for me of like how to notice that and how to try to like get myself out of that state of feeling frozen. I think that's the most applicable one in my life right now, but it's definitely not the only one.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I'm kind of like, how long do we have to answer this question? Because, knowing information is one thing. Putting it into practice and integrating it in with like all of the other things that that's where it sometimes gets tricky, right? Mine is probably so basic and like foundational that, I hope people don't lose respect for me in sharing this. But mine is like the most basic elements of self-care in the sense that when I am feeling stressed, overwhelmed, I have a lot on my plate, the first thing I give up is my sleep.
Okay.
And you're talking to a girly who likes her sleep. So I know I function better with a full night's sleep. I know that like mentally, emotionally, I'm more regulated, but just because of the way that my day shapes out, when I'm in session, I'm on all day. And then when
Yeah.
I finish, a lot of times, then I'm with my family. It's dinner, it's cleanup, it's homework, it's doing hair, it's like, that. And so oftentimes the only like really quiet time that I have is at night.
Yeah.
And I'm not a morning person. So I know a lot of people will say, well, just wake up early and take that quiet time in the morning.
Sure.
And I probably should, but I have not mastered that yet. And so what I end up doing is staying up late, to
Yeah,
finish notes, to respond to things, to even have
yeah,
just a little bit of like creative space to plan for things. That's what
right.
I end up doing. And it just snowballs because then if I do that and I'm tired, I'm less likely to get movement in the morning. I'm less likely to like plan my meals in a way that works for me. So that is something that, like, I sometimes get it on track, but keeping it on track is a challenge. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's one of those things that I feel like we preach all the time because it's like the
all the
foundation
time.
to
Yeah.
everything. It always kind of starts with like, okay, well, like, how are you sleeping? And it impacts so much, but it's just such a human thing for that to happen. So I'm glad that you brought that up too.
For sure. So, I am excited to, hear and talk about this question, so I think we can jump right in.
Okay, so this question comes from a 38-year-old male, and they wrote in and asked, "How do you continue to operate around a mentor that you once looked up to, but did something to lose your respect based on how you view things in life now?" In parentheses, personal preference. How do you keep the relationship intact and healthy? Carly, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I am excited to talk about this question because, my initial thought was, "Ooh, it's very short, like, I need more
Mm,
context," right? Like,
yeah,
I wanna
yeah,
know, of course, what did they do?
yeah,
So but I think the fact that it's maybe a little shorter without context gives us a little bit more room in terms of what we can talk about, so I kinda wanna
yeah,
play with a few different, like, scenarios, because that's
yeah.
what I found myself thinking was it might depend on what they did and, like,
Yeah,
how that maybe doesn't agree with your view that, to me, would determine the best way to respond. So,
yeah,
my initial thought was, what was it? And I do just wanna say when I see in parentheses, personal preference, the way that I interpreted it, I don't know if you read that differently, but the way I interpreted it is like it's not something that is maybe objectively wrong or, like, morally wrong, like, it's more of, I don't care for that or, I personally don't respect it, but, like, not something, like, catastrophic or something that everyone would agree is wrong. That's how I took it, but did you read that differently?
no, I thought the same thing. I was
Okay.
and that was my first question too of kind of like, what was it? Because that impacts so much of kind of what a response would be. But with that kind of like, they lost my respect for some reason, but it in parentheses personal preference, that to me kind of was like, yeah, it wasn't this like hugely wrong thing that I want to cut ties with them. And the question was like, how do you keep the relationship intact and healthy? So it does kind of seem like maybe they're just drifting apart a little bit. It's not this like huge kind of blow up, really, really big thing. So I also read it that way. We could be wrong, but I don't know. Maybe it's safe to assume that that might be what they're implying.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. And so, with that in mind, I kind of just want to acknowledge if it is for you like a moral issue, if it's something that, just far exceeds your limit as to like what you can even maintain, your ability to even maintain a relationship, I think that's a slightly different category. So I want to acknowledge that as valid, but like we may not go as in depth on, that part of it.
Yeah.
Um, so, some of my initial thoughts were just honestly being able to relate to the idea of holding someone in a particular light and, having maybe respect, admiration for someone, really seeing them as like a guide and a help, a support. And then getting a little bit of a peek behind the curtain and maybe realizing that the image you had drawn up in your mind, maybe partially from what they've shown you, but also just because of what you've assumed, um, what it's like when that gets dispelled. And then you're kind of left with like, ugh, it kind of reminds me like when you when you learn more about a celebrity and you like love them
Yes.
until they do an interview or you follow them on social media and you're like, oh, that kind of killed it for me, you know?
Yes. I I had the same thought. My mind definitely went to, like, we do this to public figures a lot. And also, when it's somebody that you know and it's a mentor, it feels, like, harder to
Yep.
lose it.
Yep.
It's a loss. But I did not mean to interrupt you. Please keep going.
No, no, that's fine. So I think it's something a lot of people can relate to. Um, some of my initial thoughts are, is there, people are nuanced, right? Like more than one thing can be true. And it is possible that this person is an excellent mentor, maybe in one aspect of their life, maybe professionally. Um, and someone that you do admire and look up to, but it is also possible that they're maybe not a mentor in their personal life or in their spiritual life or in the way that they operate amongst family or friends, right? And I think, with what I guess a lot of people would call cancel culture, there is a lot of just like throw the whole person away. Like, and depending on what you've done, sometimes, I mean, I think that that is somewhat valid.
Sure.
Maybe I'm not supposed to admit that, but I think sometimes people just cross lines where you're like, yeah, there's no coming back from that.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, However, I think it takes a certain amount of like self-awareness, emotional maturity, emotional intelligence to be able to recognize that not being great in one area doesn't always necessarily detract from being great in another. And so one of my
yeah,
initial thoughts was like, what type of mentor is this? If this is a professional mentor, which is the way that I was kind of reading it, then is it possible to still receive their input, their advice, their guidance, their wisdom professionally? And maybe if they're offering a little extra, you just, you know, thanks, but it kind of sits to the side. You know what I mean? Like in other words,
sure.
can you still um hold respect for who they are professionally without needing to respect everything about all of the decisions that they make?
Yeah,
You can respect the person and not respect a decision that they've made, right?
yeah,
So, I
yeah.
don't know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that, what you are saying and, kinda hit the nail on the head of, like, people are nuanced and there is, and just to kind of, like, call this what it is, this is a loss. This is a loss for this person in kind of, like, grieving the idea of somebody or the role that this person might have played in their life, and now trying to create a new relationship, meaning understanding of what their dynamic looks like. I think for better or worse, we do put people on pedestals, and so we might not realize that we're putting certain expectations on them, um, based on our values or things that kind of come up for us. Um, and I think that says a lot about what that mentor might have meant at a certain point in this listener's life. Um, and that's something that I was kind of thinking about too. Like Carly, I was definitely thinking about your point of can they can they still be a mentor in maybe a certain area of your life? And also, this is something that we had talked about a couple episodes back when talking about like your therapist can be good for a time. I wonder if there's a little bit of room here to also accept that like this mentor might have been a really good resource at a time in your life, and maybe now things have changed. Like you see the world a little bit differently. Maybe you have a different worldview based on experiences that you've gone through, and your values or your ideas are no longer aligning. That doesn't mean that, I know earlier I kind of said that this is a loss. It there can be a grieving of that change, but the relationship itself isn't a loss. Like you still clearly got something from this relationship at a time in your life. It helped you grow in whatever way it did. Um, and it's okay to kind of be growing differently or to be growing apart. Um, yeah, what do you think about that, Carly?
Yeah, I'm glad you said it because it's one of the things that, like I had written down, which was you don't have to erase the past to honor how
Uh-huh.
you feel today.
Uh-huh.
And you do sometimes outgrow situations, people, jobs, whatever it is. And so you can appreciate the way that they've mentored you in the past, but also decide that maybe you need a different type of mentor moving forward.
Right.
Maybe you've kind of surpassed their level of expertise to be able to support you. You know what I
Sure.
mean? Like, again, I keep going back to the professional piece, but it's possible that they were great to get you to a certain point, but now
Sure.
you're kind of at a level where it's like, okay, I need guidance on something that maybe they've not yet experienced, or they're not as
Sure.
knowledgeable about, or
Sure.
just you're now choosing a path that kind of veers off from what they've chosen, and so therefore they're not as able to advise you on that. I think
Yeah.
that's a natural part of life. I think it happens in plenty of relationships. I think it happens in parent-child relationships,
Yeah.
right? Where, like, how many people there was a time where your parents may have been your everything, like, they maybe knew what to do even if you didn't wanna follow what they told you needed to do. Like, they had the
Mhm.
information, they had the expertise, and then there are many of us who end up parenting our parents in some ways, whether that be just due to older age or because they
Mhm.
need you to show them how to get on the TikTok or the whatever they call the Facebook or whatever, however they refer to it. So, I mean, like, those roles kind of shift, and that's okay. That can be a sign of
Yeah.
growth, that can be a sign of maturity. And so I
Sure.
hear the loss element of it, but part of me was like, hey, maybe this means you just kind of like outgrew this person as a mentor, and it's
Right.
time, for something different or someone different for this new phase.
Right. Right. Yeah, as you're talking, some other things kind of like came up for me too, in this idea of how challenging the loss of respect is. Maybe like trying to reframe that a little bit. I don't know. I guess my thoughts are kind of going towards like sometimes mentorship relationships can be a little bit one-sided in terms of like thought or input. And so there might be a little bit of room now to kind of like push back on maybe some ideas, or to kind of say, I don't actually really know how I feel about that thought process. I'm kind of seeing it this way. So when you were talking about like that role reversal, that might not be appropriate in this context. Like it might be professional, where it might not make sense to kind of like push back, or share a little bit more of your thoughts or insights. Um, but the other thing that I was thinking with like that loss of respect is, and how do you keep the relationship intact and healthy? The idea of like assuming best intent and trying to like see, they might see things differently. They might be part of a different generation. They might not have all the information that you have. It doesn't necessarily mean that how they're thinking about something, like, that their values are in direct contrast with yours. You just might have different information. And so if this is somebody that, like, clearly you've had a relationship with, you've had respect for in the past, maybe kind of assuming best intent of, like, "All right, I'm really starting to see things differently. I'm starting to see them a little bit differently." That doesn't necessarily mean that I can't try to see, like, well, maybe they mean it in this way. Maybe I can assume best intent for what they're saying, still have a little bit of that respect for them. And if we're just kind of clashing, like slowly kind of stepping back, not reaching out to them all the time for advice, or trying to find other mentors that maybe align with you a little bit better at this point in your life. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent piece of advice, and I can also understand why that can be so hard to do
Sure.
at times,
Sure.
right? Especially
Sure.
depending on what type of mentor they've been. So we're talking about like the professional side. I'm also thinking about the fact that there can be spiritual mentors. There can
Hmm.
be mentors I come from like a big sports family, and so sometimes coaches and trainers, and they can really become mentors to young people that I mean, it can be in some instances a closer bond than a parent, or sometimes they
Hmm.
can fill the role of a missing parent, grandparent, close friend, or uncle aunt type of relationship. And I think depending on how you're impacted by whatever decision they made that caused you to lose that respect, it
Sure.
gets harder and harder to assume that positive intent. I
Sure.
hear this listener saying, like, I, I don't want to lose the relationship. I want it to be healthy, but like, how do I
Yeah.
move forward with this? And so I'm just trying to acknowledge, if you feel like you've maybe been misguided, especially in like your spiritual beliefs, or you've been almost sold a bag of goods that, like, aren't really valid, or, they really
Uh,
then didn't show up for you in a way where you were counting
Yeah.
on them, or you
Yeah.
feel like they did something that, like, maybe was a bit malicious, or malicious is assuming intent, maybe just at your
Yeah.
expense. Like, you feel like they kinda threw you under the bus or didn't take an advantage of an opportunity to stand up for you. It gets harder and harder to assume that positive intent. I
Uh-huh.
talk a lot in therapy about intent versus impact, and I
Sure.
am a person who will try to help people at least see what the positive intent could be, because I think we
Sure.
have to always leave a little bit of room for the idea that the person meant well, even if you don't understand why they would choose those tactics, right?
Uh,
Um,
yeah.
but sometimes it's hard for people to grasp that depending on how they've been impacted by it. Um,
Yeah.
One like scenario that kind of comes to mind, and I may be adding a little bit too much to it here, but particularly as a woman, as a Black woman, um, mentorship is like everything in our communities. Sometimes because of gatekeeping, because of prejudice, because of bias, like having people that you look up to in a particular area and who are experienced in that and who sometimes serve as gatekeepers, that can literally be make or break for, like your career, for getting an opportunity, for getting that interview. And I do know a lot of people of my generation who have felt incredibly disappointed and let down by people who are more advanced in their careers, who look like them and maybe don't take those opportunities to open that door, or um to, like, in some instances, the gatekeeping, like, it needs to be knocked down a bit, or, like, step in and actually you're in a position of power. Like, maybe you feel like that person should be doing something that they're not doing.
Yeah.
And so I know that's something that comes up a lot. I know it's something that I've felt, personally. And so I just kind of want to acknowledge that piece of it, because while the intent may not be, to keep you out or to hurt you in some way, when you're wielding power and not really aware of how that's impacting other people, or like the doors that you're kind of like you got through and then you let it shut behind you, you don't hold it open for anyone. I could see
Sure.
why people have a really hard time assuming that positive intent. Does that make
Sure.
sense?
Of course, absolutely. I'm so glad that you brought that up too. I think that um something that struck me as you were saying that is this happens all the time, but like our meaning of something. Like we can be talking about the same thing and two different things completely just based on what our experience or our meaning of something, right? And so to your point, mentorship might look a lot different because of, your culture and because of having the experience of how much mentorship means in the Black community. And so I am curious about like what are your thoughts around if it's harder to keep that best intent, which I think is a really great point. How does somebody who wants to keep the relationship intact and healthy, but might feel really hurt, who might feel upset, who might feel like slighted in some way, how would you approach that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it may not be applicable in all cases. But my first thought, even before potentially addressing it with the person, my first thought is do a little inventory and just make sure you're not perpetuating the very thing that you feel so slighted by. Okay.
Uh,
So it's easy to get really caught up in, like, this person disappointed me, like, that, they didn't show up for me in the way that I needed. And just like the person that you're maybe being critical of, you can lose sight of the areas of influence that you have. You can lose sight of the people that are maybe looking up to you. And I'm saying that because the listener did identify themselves as like a male in his later 30s. And so, one of my initial thoughts was, okay, who are you mentoring and how is
Uh-huh.
this influencing the way that you then show up for your mentees? Right.
Uh-huh.
So I
Uh-huh.
maybe by default, I don't know if it's a healthy thing, but like that turn inward, I'm always going to encourage that turn inward first, right? Like,
Yeah.
how is this
Right.
informing the way that I show up in spaces where I might have a similar power and may not be, wielding it so intentionally? That's one of my first thoughts.
Okay.
One of my next thoughts is I think you got to have a conversation with yourself about whether this is something you want to address with the person
Sure.
or not. And I think whether or not that's best really depends on the person, the relationship, to your point, and how those relationships can be very one sided. Like if this is a strictly professional mentor, meet up, I don't know, once a month or once a quarter, they kind of pencil you into 30 minutes of their day. They may not be looking for feedback from you. And
Sure.
it's unfortunate because it may actually serve them to have some feedback. But
Sure.
if you know that the relationship isn't really set up that way, or if just based on what you've learned about them, you discover that they're not necessarily a person who takes well to feedback, I could see a circumstance where maybe you decide, like, that's not going to be helpful here. But if the relationship is solid enough and has like enough flexibility that you're having somewhat open, honest conversations where it's two sided, I think you should consider at least expressing how you feel. I
Sure.
don't think that you need to tell the person that what they're doing is wrong, right? Maybe
Mm.
it's not wrong according to their values and like they've got to face themselves in the morning. So if they're living according to what aligns for them, they may not feel that it's wrong. But you
Uh-huh.
can tell them, like, I felt really disappointed, or I was kind of hurt when I saw X, Y, and Z, or you made this choice and I'm confused because it doesn't really align with what I thought, how I thought you had advised me. And I'm having a hard time reconciling that. Right. So I
Sure.
think the important thing is if you're going to address it, you address your own feelings, you own your own feelings. It's not about telling them who or what they are, but it's about
Uh-huh.
owning the fact that, like, this hit me, this impacted me, and I thought it was
Sure.
important that and I would
Sure.
hope that someone that is being a mentor from a genuine space, even
Right.
if it's hard to hear or even if they get a little defensive, that they would take that and, kind of take it into consideration.
Right. Right. I think that subconsciously, that's a little bit of where I was leaning with this question of almost just this like, I hope that this could be an opportunity for this relationship to even grow a little bit stronger and deeper where maybe there's some growth in the relationship. I'm going to assume that this person knows the relationship, knows what they're feeling, right? Maybe it might make sense for them to just kind of say like, yeah, it's changing and I can't really help that. But if there is an opportunity to kind of say like I want to address this. I feel close enough to address this. I think that it could be a good conversation, a good growth point for our relationship. Then I think that if that's an option, then that would be wonderful too. And I think maybe that's a little bit of what I was thinking of or leaning towards in this question of like, in some respects, it feels like, oh, maybe there's a growth past this. And in other ways, maybe there could be a growth together.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think one way or the other, the relationship is changing. Like, it kind of
Right.
already
Right.
has to a degree.
Right.
So, I mean, what it looks like moving forward, there are two people that like have some say in that, but you
Yeah.
can decide on your end either maybe we kind of hit a ceiling and,
Mhm.
this
Yeah.
is where we part ways. You can
Mhm.
decide, like we said earlier, that you can still respect their advice in one aspect of life, but maybe you just don't care to take their advice in other areas. Um, Or, in some instances, you can work through it. I think that that's unfortunately rare. I wish it wasn't
Sure.
so rare. But I
Sure.
mean, taking feedback is hard. Like just
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
shoot the mentor a little bit of bail when you've been advising someone and you maybe perceive yourself as being more advanced in a particular area,
Yeah.
to like take that feedback can be hard. So I would, anticipate that it might not be the easiest to digest, but
Sure.
I think being able to talk about it and then move forward, like, and have that be received, you might have a mentor for life. You might have a friend for
Yeah.
life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It might really take the relationship to the next level. So I'm
Yeah.
hopeful that that would be an option. I don't know, just based on the amount that was shared, like how realistic that is. But it's hard to have someone fall off of a pedestal that you had them
Mhm.
on.
Mhm.
Sometimes that speaks a little bit more to your expectations than it does to what they actually owed you. And so
Sure.
leave a little bit of room for that. People are people, and sometimes they make choices that were like, "Oh, I don't like that."
I know, I know. Um, I just two kind of final thoughts, just as you were talking. The first one being, um, if you are gonna have that conversation, taking feedback is hard, and so how you start that conversation is important. Um, that soft startup that we've talked about before around like, "Hey, this might be a difficult conversation. Like, I respect you so much. I've learned so much from you. I want to continue having the relationship that we've had. You know, you've meant a lot to me. I've gotten a lot from you. I want to be honest with you about how I've been feeling about something." So if that's a conversation that you feel like you can have, I think that or a variation, obviously, in your own words, something around that could be helpful to navigate that conversation or to start that conversation. Um, taking ownership in your own feelings over it, like, going into it with the goal of connection. Um, and then my final thought too, and this is based off something you said, Carly, but the relationship is changing. So when this listener asks, how do you keep the relationship intact and healthy? If nothing changes, if you keep just kind of like biting your tongue and letting this frustration rise and you're like, I just have to get over it, that's just going to increase resentment. And so, kind of remembering that too. Like if you kind of just try to white knuckle it and you're like, I don't want to bring it up. I don't want to make things weird. I'm just going to put up with this. It's probably going to lead to a uh, more tumultuous kind of relationship in the long run. And so it's okay that things are changing. You have some sense of control over how this changes and how it navigates. And you have to trust yourself a little bit too, and being able to navigate it either by saying, I'm going to take a step back, I'm going to, distance myself a little bit emotionally, or I'm going to address this and I trust myself to have this conversation no matter how they take it.
Yeah, I like that, and I like that, like, no matter how they take it, you gotta be okay with once you share, it may change things, and,
Yeah.
that may just be a part of it, but you'll grow as a result of it. If you lose a mentor, then I'm almost certain that that means that a door can open for another mentor, and then
Yeah.
it can make you a better mentor yourself, so I'm
Yes.
always, gonna encourage that.
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. If you'd like to hear our thoughts on a topic that matters to you, email your question to info@askatherapistpod.com. We'd also like to hear your thoughts on today's topic. What resonated? What didn't? What did we miss? If you have advice for our listener, please share it. You may just hear your feedback on a future episode. You can follow us on Instagram and TikTok at askatherapist_pod. Emails and DMs are always welcome. Also, if you'd like to connect with me or Kenzie and learn more about the services we offer in our private practices, check the show notes for ways to reach us directly. With that, we're signing off. Thanks for listening. And remember, don't wing it, just ask a therapist.
That's it for today's episode. We hope it gave you something to reflect on, or maybe even that aha moment.
If so, you know the drill. Rate, review, subscribe, and don't forget to text it to the group chat. Remember, sharing is caring.
If you have a question you want us to tackle, big or small, we want to hear it.
Email us at info@askatherapistpod.com or slide into our DMs on Instagram at askatherapist_pod.
You bring the questions.
We'll bring the insight and probably a metaphor or two.
This is Ask a Therapist.
See you next time.